Hello and welcome to Embracing Your Earth Journey. I'm your host, Stephanie Briggs, and I am thrilled to be here today speaking with the amazing Lyla June. Welcome, Lyla.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it is my pleasure. Lyla June is a poet, musician, human ecologist, public speaker, and community organizer of Dene, Cheyenne, and European lineages. Her dynamic, multi-genre performance style has invigorated and inspired audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. Her messages focus on Indigenous rights, supporting youth, intercultural healing, historical trauma, and traditional land stewardship practices. And Lyla, I'm so excited that you're back. It was really amazing to work with you on the Feminine Emergence Summit in 2018. And you just always have such powerful wisdom to share that's really needed for folks. And so today you're going to be sharing with us about re-matriating the land and the spirit.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, so to get started, can you share a bit about how can we each connect with our own Indigenous culture, no matter where we're from?
Sure. So I think it's really important for us to understand that it's not just Native Americans who are indigenous to a place. And that although many of us may have been severed from our indigenous lands much longer ago, it doesn't mean we aren't indigenous to a place. And it doesn't mean that we don't have ancestors that are very, very beautiful and connected to cultures that were once earth-based and were once honoring of the feminine and were once cultures that could actually create a harmony amongst themselves and amongst them and the environment. And so I've been doing a lot of research that a lot of people know about into my European side, because my mom is Dene and my dad is mostly European. And so I've been doing a lot of research into that because I kind of, how would you say, took that part of me. I don't want to be white. I'm just going to pretend like I'm full-blooded Dene, because they're the colonizer and they're the slave master and blah, blah, blah. And so, I had a lot of shame, in that part of myself. And I tried to pretend it wasn't there for a long time. And so when I was about 19 or so, it was actually my Dene ancestors and elders who encouraged me to connect more with that European side. Because in our culture and as Dene people, we have to honor all 4 clans that we descend from. So we started to dig into my European clans. And your 4 clans come from your 4 grandparents. And so it's really important to dig into that side of yourself. So I started to see that Europeans are really similar to Native Americans in the sense that we both had been through language prohibition. If you got caught speaking Welsh in school in the 1920s, you would have to get a block of wood tied around your neck with the letters WN written on it, which stood for Welsh knot. And the only way you could get the Welsh knot off your neck is if you caught another kid speaking Welsh, and then you would put it on their neck. And so that's how the Welsh language was nearly obliterated. One of the ways. Also, King Edward I, a British king, ordered the massacre of over 100 Celtic, Gaelic, and Welsh harpists in the 1200s. And so that was really an articulated offense to kill the musicians, the storytellers, the bards, the people who carried the culture. And so when the British Army would go into Scotland, they would kill the bards first. And the bards were the ones who held the stories and the songs. And so they would bury the bards face down so that their stories would die with them. That was the, the awful symbolic gesture that to add insult to injury of we're not just killing you, we're killing everything, all the wisdom you carry. And so that's what a lot of Europeans are carrying, and we don't even know it. You also, obviously, you have the Roman expansion, which destroyed countless individuals and cultures. And so another similarity between Native Americans and Europeans is the epidemics. You have about 98% of Native Americans die off to disease. Of course, my elders will say it wasn't the virus that killed us, it was the fear that killed us. The fear gave a fertile soil for that virus to take root. And that if we were, it was hard not to be afraid, right? Because these people were brutal and they were destroying things with no honor. And we had never seen anything like that in many generations. So it was hard, but they also, have that in Europe, where you have about a third of Europe disappearing overnight to the Black Death or the bubonic plague. Again, during a time of great fear in Europe, but during a time of great terror and, you know, destruction. And so what we have is, Europeans carrying the trauma of losing a third of their population overnight. um, that is something that we can relate on. Similarly, the women, of course, the way the women were treated in Native culture was that, when my Dene ancestors were put in a concentration camp for 4 years, the women didn't have water for their children, and the only way the soldiers would give them water is if they would go and sleep with the soldiers. So this is how the women were systematically raped in this concentration camp. And then the men, our menfolk, had to watch that because they were at gunpoint. And so it didn't destroy our bodies; it destroyed our spirits. Because the women feel icky because they feel like they, let the rape happen to them or whatever. They blame themselves, even though clearly they're not. There's nothing. They didn't do anything wrong, and it never touched them because they are their spirit, they're not their body. But it's easy to trick the woman's mind, and then it destroys the spirit of the men because they feel like they failed to protect the women. And so the whole rape is very much a tool of warfare, psychological, spiritual warfare. So similarly, in Europe, you have millions of women being persecuted as witches, and being burned alive, drowned alive, and many times men would rape these women and then say, oh, well, she was a witch. She seduced me with her magical witch powers, and therefore it's her fault and we should burn her. That really happened. There's a whole book on it that was published long ago, hundreds of years ago, which was a manual of how to decide whether a woman was a witch or not. And this manual often included that she would seduce you. So imagine being a husband watching your wife get burned, a son watching your mother get burned. This is meant to destroy the spirits, not just of the women, but of the men who love them. And that creates a huge rift, a gender rift. And then the men are trying to make up for it in all of these unhealthy ways, even though they never lost their manhood. And so basically, my point is that whether we're Native American or European, or Asian, or from India, or from Australia, or from Africa, or any other corner of the world, we are all indigenous to a place, and we all carry beautiful culture. For instance, in German soil in 2009, they found a clay figurine in the soil, and it was of a woman. And this represented both the women and the earth and the sanctity of each. And they radiocarbon dated this thing. It was 40,000 years old. So it's really important to look beyond the thin layer of time that dominates our understanding of Europe and see that, hey, wait, we come from earth people too. And we withstood thousands of years of pure terror to lose that culture. And therefore, it's important for us to honor the indigenous culture of all others, because we start to see, hey, what happened to us, we don't want that to happen to anyone else ever again. Similarly with, if you're from Korea, you were forced to speak Japanese. If you're Gazignon from northern Thailand, you were forced to become a Buddhist by the Thai kingdom. If you're from Australia, you were forced to go to white parents. If you're from Africa, clearly you were separated from your family and put on different ships and sold as if you weren't a beautiful human being deserving of respect and love and care. And so the cultures and the languages were destroyed. So all of us come from an indigenous culture, and that culture is meant to be the thread that connects us to the creator. And when you destroy that culture, you make it very hard for that population to connect anymore, because that culture was given to them by creator to help them connect to creator. And so that's why I think it's really important for all of us to understand that we all come from an indigenous background, and that even though it was brutally taken away from us, we do have the power to get it back through prayer and helping each other to do that.
Wow. Yeah, as you were sharing all this, I've just been feeling like tingles in my entire body. Like it's really landing deeply, and my spirit is responding. And um, so you're saying that, we all had a culture and a way of connecting with spirit that was meant to sustain us and connect us together and connect us with the land. And um, there's been so much, like such a lineage of destruction of so many of these cultures, and like what now? Like, how do we? So you were starting to say like how we can start to reconnect. Like, is there more about that?
Um, so I think that it's harder for some of us, right? Because that's intentional, right? It was intentional that the Romans would displace peoples. It was intentional that the slave ship owners would um, intentionally keep people apart who spoke the same language to destroy, so there's a moment of grieving that needs to happen before anything, I think, to realize, like, why do we even have to ask this question of how do we reconnect with our indigenous self? And so rematriation is about returning not just the land to the indigenous peoples, kind of like repatriation, but sort of rematriation, but also repatriating our spirit back to the earth as well, and rematriating our spirit back to the earth. And so understanding that it was meant to be hard on us, that was the whole point, and that is awful. And to not sugarcoat that, like, that hurts, um, but yes, I think that's one of the steps, is to grieve, and then the next step is to research. It's out there, if you don't know which part of Europe you're from, or Africa or Asia, then you can always pray about it, and it'll show up. It'll be revealed to you. Like, I went to Devon, England once, and did a class there, and then when I came back home, I found some old family members I'd never met before, and they showed me a family book, and they said, oh, and by the way, the Sweet, because on my dad's side, his mom's last name is Sweet, the Sweet family house is in this place called Devon, England. And I just thought that was amazing, that I had magically gone right back home, and so just trust that your spirit is bringing you home. Similarly, I went to stop at Childress, Texas overnight, and visited these sacred mounds that I was called to. And then I went to visit my auntie in Nacogdoches, Texas, and she said, oh yeah, by the way, your great grandpa was a preacher in a little town called Childress. And I was like, wow, I went right back. Who knows if he was always a preacher, if he had indigenous blood, I don't know. But your spirit will bring you back home.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit more about the land that we're on now, which is the land that's currently known as the United States. What is the history of this land?
So we are encouraging people to call it Turtle Island, and that is from an Anishinaabe creation story where Sky Woman fell on a turtle's back, and then she created, with the help of various animal friends and allies, she created this continent. And so we try to not call it the United States of America because it has that word America in it, which is from Amerigo Vespucci, who was commissioned to look for slaves and gold. And so unless we want to be defined by a culture of conquest that normalizes and condones slavery and the raping of the earth for gold, then we might not want to name ourselves after Amerigo Vespucci. Not, I don't judge him. I don't know who the heck he was, but I do know that was his official business, and it's recorded in the history books. That's what he went out to do. And so this land now, it has a history, a long history of exactly what happened in Europe, the destruction of a people. And I really feel that Europe was a testing ground for what happened here in on Turtle Island, because all of the same techniques that the Romans used against the indigenous peoples of Europe, relocation, language prohibition, rape, those were all sort of transferred over here to this land and implemented. And so I really feel that the European experiment, which was a horrific human experiment of conquest and destruction, was simply exported out to this land. And so it's really important that we as so-called Americans take the time to acknowledge that the same exact thing happened here. And it's hard, right? It's really hard to acknowledge that our ancestors were a part of that, or that we are even beneficiaries of that still today. It is hard, but there's a beautiful liberation in acknowledging that, because then we get to be a part of essentially transforming the legacy of colonization. And what we have here in the United States is a land grabs. We have treaties where land was promised to Native peoples. Of course, these treaties were signed at gunpoint. You know, it's like, we'll give you this little bit of land if you give us all of this. And we're like, okay, as long as you don't kill my family. And then even that little bit that we were promised was taken away. And so this whole, all the land that we have, if we are non-Native American, is stolen. And it's just the truth, and not just stolen, but brutally, violently stolen. And so and Native American communities still live in the shadow of colonization today. We still, to this day, the genocide is continuing in different forms, everything from disenfranchisement to not taking care of people's environments and using their lands for uranium mining, coal mining, fracking, etc. Yeah, I don't think I need to preach to the choir here, but you know, we live in a place of pure, brutal colonization that persists and is so normalized and so ubiquitous that we kind of don't even realize we're swimming in it sometimes. But we are still living it and perpetuating it, most times accidentally, but sometimes intentionally. And so we, whether we're from Africa, a lot of us, you know, intermarried with Native people. Most African Americans are part Native American. A lot of European Americans are also part Native American, and they don't really have permission to claim it because they don't have the little card that says, oh yeah, I'm Chickasaw, or I'm, you know, Cherokee or whatever. But I'm of the camp, the school of thought that says we should support each other in claiming that identity, because if we don't, then the genocide is complete. And so we have a really hard deck of cards that we've been dealt here. If you're born into this land, you have a lot of soul searching to do and a lot of things to think about, depending on the color of your skin, where your parents are from, blah, blah, blah. But I, for one, think that every single one of us has the opportunity and has a role, a unique role and a unique purpose in the recreation of harmony in this land. Like, there's certain things I can do that you can't do because of my package that creator gave me, because of the lineage creator gave me, and vice versa. There's certain things that you can do that I can't do. And so I think that's the context we're living in this land. And I'll get into it a little bit more later, but it's not, to me, like in permaculture, they say the problem is the solution. And so there's ways that we could turn this situation into something very beautiful if we have the right guidance and tools.
Mm. Yeah, so like how can we begin to transform this legacy of colonization?
Well, one thing is a lot of people have been looking into their ancestry. Um, and they're really heartbroken to find like, oh shoot, my great 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 grandpa owned slaves. Or rather, I shouldn't say slaves, enslaved people. Um, and it's really hard to reckon with that. Or maybe they look in their history and they're like, oh shoot, this land was given to me in the Homesteading Act, which was part and parcel of displacing Indigenous peoples. Um, or wow, I am I'm in this honors AP class in high school and there's no brown kids in here. Like what's going, is it because they're not as smart as us? No, that can't be. Then why aren't they in here? When I was in high school, I was always the only brown kid in the AP classes. Maybe one of two, and why is that? Why? And furthermore, why is the curriculum the way that it is? Why are we focusing on learning Shakespeare and chemistry and all of these disciplines and traditions which are very Eurocentric in nature when we live on a land that is not Europe? And why are Indigenous children forced to measure up to these Eurocentric standards? Blah 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 blah. You could go on and on. So I think that it's really important for us um, to rematriate. And what I mean by that is there's this whole movement going on about repatriating land. And not all of us have lands to give away. I, Even if we are of European descent, not all of us are wealthy. But we do sit on a mountain, generally speaking. European Americans sit on a mountain of wealth that was amassed through the process of slavery and land theft and genocide. Not saying we're bad people, but saying that we have an opportunity to awaken to how this wealth got under us and how we can, it's so exciting to me, we can be a part of healing that. We get to be a part of healing that. We get to be a part of making our children proud to be European American, of saying like, wow, my mom and my dad got together and they made it a point in their lives to be a part of the healing of Indigenous communities. They made it a part of an intentional part of their lives to do what they could to uplift African American communities in the way that African American communities asked to be uplifted. And then our children, as European Americans, our children have a pride and have a joy of like, wow, we descend from fine stock. We descend from people of beautiful hearts and conscience. And so that's exciting to me, that we are, again, that's something only European Americans can do. I can't do that. I mean, I am part European American, but for instance, like a full, quote unquote, full blood Native American, like couldn't do that the way that we can. And we can sort of model what it looks like. And for African Americans, we are, I shouldn't say we, because I'm not African American that I know of, but they also have a unique role, which is not mine to define, but it is a role of being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and being in solidarity with the Native peoples who they are also living on their land, and also taking a moment to research, am I part in Native American? Because like I said, African Americans and Native Americans, we had been through the same crap. We were both tribal peoples recently. We were both earth-based cultures. We had both been oppressed. We had both been said we were an inferior race. But we both knew deep down that we were both beautiful. And so we fit together really easily in the South. And most African Americans are part Indigenous. If you ask them, like, oh yeah, well, my grandma's part this, or my grandma was that, so and again, they don't have the little card that says I am this, but Native Americans have always been a people of oral history. And so, so I think the big thing I'm talking about today, though, is giving land back. That is a really big thing that's happening now. A woman just texted me the other day. She said, my cousin owns an island off the coast of Vancouver. Can you help her give it back to Native Americans? I was like, that's not a text you get every day, right? Like, my cousin owns an island. Can I get this back to her? And so there's another group of people who say, hey, we have this land and we want to give it back. Or I have 3 acres and I just need like one of them. I want to give the other 2 acres back to the Cherokee because they were kicked out of Georgia. But I have 2 acres in Georgia. They can come back home. They can use this little slice for whatever they want to use it. Maybe they want to pray there. Maybe they want to hang out there. So rematriation is really a movement that's burgeoning of giving land back to Indigenous peoples. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is how we can be a part of transforming the legacy of colonization by giving land back to Indigenous peoples.
Wow. Yes. So as we're becoming part of this process, we have it sounds like the responsibility and the opportunity and the choice to be part of that transformation and decolonization. And as part of this process, like how do Indigenous land management practices fit in? Like what can those practices do for the land and for all people?
Right. So Indigenous peoples, as we all know, I'm not just talking about Native Americans or Indigenous Turtle Islanders, but I'm also talking about everyone across the planet. We all descend from people who at some point had refined a science of living on the earth. And there's this mythology that the further we go in time, the more advanced society gets. But that is actually untrue. If you go back 1,000 years to Lake Texcoco in Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, that was one of the most advanced cultures on the planet, in the sense that they had created the original hydroponic floating gardens on Lake Texcoco. They had a whole city built on top of a lake that they built the land on the lake. And they had to poop and pee like the rest of us, but they never polluted the lake. They recycled all of their waste in the most sophisticated, incredible ways. And they had abundant food, and they had a really complex system of prayer and astronomy that was far beyond that of Galileo at the time. And so it's really important to remember that just because something old doesn't mean it's primitive. In fact, oftentimes the older things are the more advanced things. And here on what we now call the United States, but I will call Turtle Island, you have an incredible array of civilizations that sprouted all across this continent, and we managed the land extensively, and we populated the land densely. I'm talking about huge, gigantic civilizations in every corner of this continent. And you can't notice them because the supposition is that if there was a great civilization right here where I'm sitting, there would be marks on the earth that we could find today. There would be aqueducts or pyramids or something. But the thing is, our ancestors tried very hard to not make marks on the earth that you could see hundreds of years later, because we knew if you had done that, you had done something disrespectful. So all of our architecture was biodegradable. All of our architecture was meant to go back to the earth at some point. All of our material uses were often plant-based. And so, especially in California, they have a lot of their material culture was plant-based in terms of their everything from clothing to utensils to all of these things. And the majority of these plants were managed by fire. And so fire is one example of how we manage the land. We were the original prescribed burners. And the entirety of California was managed with low intensity fires. And what you see is whole ecosystems becoming dependent on human fire, oak trees, savannas that were burned. And one Amamutsan elder that I spoke to said, our rule of thumb is 14 trees per acre, because if now you see 200 to 400 trees on an acre. You know, he's the original peoples of what is now called Santa Cruz, California, the Amamutsan. And he said that if we have 400 trees on an acre, they're all starving because there's limited soil, there's limited nutrients, water, and sunlight. And so they're all competing. And so he said, would you rather have a bunch of sick trees whose immune systems are shot, who are probably going to die off anyways to the first virus that rips through them? Or are we going to have a few strong, healthy trees that provide food, not just for us, but for the squirrels, for the birds, for everyone? And so they created these oak savannas and maintained them for thousands of years. And these the acorns provided a major foundation of their diet. And so also, like in Kentucky, for example, there's these soil cores that you can analyze, and you can analyze the fossilized pollen back 10,000 years. You get them from ponds because the pollen will fall on the pond and it will settle to the bottom and fossilize. And the sediment at the very bottom of the soil core is older. So this one core they took out of Kentucky, the bottommost sediment layer was 10,000 years old. That's when it was deposited into the lake. And you see, for about 10,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago, it was a cedar and hemlock forest. And then right at 3,000 years ago, you have this influx of chestnut, hickory nut, black walnut, and an acorn. And so and also right around 3,000 years ago, you see fossilized charcoal show up, which shows that they managed this food forest with fire. And this food forest persisted for 3,000 years, up until about 1830, when the Europeans moved in and destroyed the chestnuts with the chestnut blight, because they didn't know how to manage the forests. So what you have is this food forest that ancestors, the Shawnee ancestors, cultivated and maintained for 3,000 years without killing it off. America's not even 300 years old, and we're already basically self-destructing, ecologically, socially, politically, everything. And so 3,000 years, that's an order of magnitude longer than how old America is. Not only were they still there, but they were thriving with this food forest all around them. Another example is the Heiltsuk Nation in British Columbia, Canada. They have a profound aquaculture, which, for example, they hand plant kelp gardens. These days, it's a little more modern, so they get a long rope along the shoreline, and then they'll plant these kelp plants along the rope. And that specific kelp species grows very fast. And the herring, which is a fish, a small fish, lays its eggs on the surface of the kelp. And those eggs, the roe, are a delicacy, not just for human beings, but for salmon, killer whales, wolves, everything that depends on those species. And so single-handedly, literally with their own hands, they are increasing the surface area that herring can lay their roe, and thereby expanding the base of the food web for the entire ecosystem, such that if the Heiltsuk Nation was to disappear, the whole ecosystem would collapse. And so this is how humanity managed to become a keystone species. A keystone species is one which, if you were to take it out, it would seriously affect the rest of the environment, such as the beaver. You know, the beaver makes the dam, and that specific dam habitat creates the basis for a lot of different species to exist. And so if you take out the beavers, which happened during the fur trade, you destroy all kinds of stuff. And so this is important to understand, that human beings, we are not misfits of the earth. We are not outcasts. We are not this accident, that created. A lot of people say, oh, the world would be so much better if humans didn't exist. That is not true. Creator made us for a reason. We're supposed to be here. we're not just an accident. Creator doesn't do things on accident. Creator makes every rock, every deer, every star, every cloud, every person for a reason. And so our job as human beings, our role is to steward the land. And the reason we have these big brains, one of the reasons is because we were put here to take care of the land. And mind you, that food forests that the Shawnee created, which also included goosefoot and sumpweed and all kinds of edible species, that did not just provide food for them, but for all the animals in the forest. And when you burn around the trees, and you create an opening, and all the explorers, whenever they come to Turtle Island, they say, oh, it was like a park. It was this beautiful park that was spacious and open in the savannah, and it looked like nature just created a masterpiece, and the soil was so fertile, it dug like ash. And the explorers say that about Turtle Island, and they say it about Australia too. And so these were two places where, not the only places, where the indigenous land stewardship practice was in full swing, and people were altering the way that the land looked and tasted on regional scales. I'm talking entire biomes are sculpted by human hands. The last example I will give is the Terra Preta, which means the Black Earth. And they call it the Indian Black Earth, but it's in the Amazon. And it's this soil system that was developed by the indigenous Amazonians and is still developed today, which creates very deep, we're talking meters deep, layers of A-horizon soil systems that are incredibly, fertile. And so that provided the basis for a lot of the Amazon rainforest. And so people look at the Amazon rainforest and like, oh, what a wonder of nature. It's so beautiful. And gosh, isn't nature just beautiful? But this isn't wild. This is anthropogenic. Human beings helped to create the Amazon rainforest through the development of terra preta, which is basically a very advanced composting technique where they would use bones, even pottery shards, and all of their food waste to generate these rich, loamy soils that created, if you look around the ancient villages, there's a hyper dominance of edible plant species all around these villages. And so not only did they create these soils, but they planted food species so that they had literally Eden all around them. And so Eden is not just in biblical times, and it's not just in the Fertile Crescent. It's all over the earth was meant to be Eden, a food forest, a food garden. And that is our task today, that if we were to rematriate the land, to give it back to indigenous peoples, we would be pleasantly surprised that, oh wow, these people aren't stupid, they're not primitive, and they're not savage. They're actually incredibly advanced and have incredibly advanced land management techniques. So sorry to blast you with all that, but that is just what I'm doing my PhD on, and I'm obviously a big nerd about it. But that's what I think could happen if we rematriate the land.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I don't feel blasted. I feel like I'm fascinated. I'm like, oh, tell me more. And I feel like you anticipated my next question, which was like, what's your vision for what's possible and what we can co-create as we participate, those of us who can be part of rematriating the land, and for all of us, like, to show up with our whatever we're able to do, with the guidance of Creator, like what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that healing and forgiveness and apology is possible. I think reconciliation is a beautiful idea, and yet it is only possible when not only does one side apologize, but the other side also forgives. And conversely, the other side can't just forgive, but the other side must also apologize. And that's when I think the full circle is completed of reconciliation. And it's also really important to note that this is not just a verbal apology, it's a lived apology, and not a shameful, like, oh, I'm so bad apology, but like, let's get this right. I'm excited to be a part of making this right and making my children proud. And so I think that what that looks like is really creating not just a spoken apology, but a lived apology. And here's the steps for doing that, in my opinion. Number one, find out whose land you're standing on. And I know nobody really owns land, but whose homeland, I should say, are you standing on? Do they still persist in your area? And there's a tool called Native Land. It's native-land.ca. And that's a website you can go to and see, and you just type in your zip code and it will tell you whose land you're standing on. And it's throughout Turtle Island and all of Australia as well. And so once you find out whose homeland you're standing on, then ask, do they still persist today in some form? And mind you, all the tribes today are survival bands. They do not represent the original composition of the people because 98% of us were wiped out. So what you have is whole villages disappearing. Some of the children survive, and then we take those children and bring them to the next village where everyone died except for a few children. And so there was people whose jobs it was to go from village to village and get the children that survived the disease epidemic. And so a lot of the tribes we have now are the descendants of those children who got together, didn't always speak the same language, didn't always have the same cultural practice, but had a similar enough practice where they could create a new tribe. So even Seminole and all these different tribes, they are survival bands. And so that's not to say we're any less beautiful. That's just to say that whatever you're working with is really feeling the effects of colonization to this day. And it's important to be very gentle and very humble and very loving, and gentle is the key word, just gentle, because it still hurts. Everything hurts. And so basically, do they still persist? And if so, the steps to being a part of the healing is to go to them and say these magic words. How can I help, if at all? And that restores choice, right? Because our choice as Native people has been robbed of us for 500 years. We never had a choice in what happened. So when you simply say, how can I help, if at all? That's the magic phrase. You're asking them if they need help, and they get to decide how they get helped. They get to decide what happens on their land. They get to decide what happens in their community. And so, maybe we have this great idea that we're going to do a permaculture project on the reservation, and it's going to be so beautiful, and it's going to feed everyone. But really, the moms are like, actually, we need diapers. And it's like, okay, have that humility to say, I don't understand why you need diapers, but maybe you just need diapers right now. Okay, I'm going to help do a fundraiser for diapers. Whatever the heck it is, whatever they decide. Or maybe they say, you know what? And oftentimes the thing they ask for is really incredible. One time we asked the tribe that, how can we help, if at all? And they said, we want all of you to come to our sacred place and pray. And so we had this huge multi-faith delegation come and just pray with them. And it was so amazing because at that time they needed a little bit of help in the press because that sacred spot was trying to get stolen from them. And so you never know what they're going to ask for. But that's the question. How can I help, if at all? And for me, on my end, as an Indigenous person, my job, as I see it, is to start increasing the capacity of my own people to be ready when that land is given back to us. So a lot of our knowledge, that knowledge I talked about, the land management knowledge, is being slowly eroded, and a lot of it has already been eroded. But our elders are still here, and very few of them still remember how to do this stuff. And so it's my job and our task as Indigenous youth to go to our elders and start recovering that knowledge and putting it into practice. And so that's what I view my job as, and the dream is to develop an Indigenous university, which we're working on right now, where we're getting that flow of knowledge from the elders to the youth, and we're getting all of these land management practices back in the minds and the bodies of the people. And we're creating our own food systems, and those are a model for the rest of the world. And so I want to be ready for when someone asks me, hey, I have an island I want to give to you. I want to be ready to say, okay, I'm ready to take it on, and I'm ready to use that land in a delicate, gentle, yet powerful way to change the way the world thinks about food and water. And so a lot of us are in that process of building capacity of our nations to be able to really have the knowledge and the know-how of how to say, okay, yes, we are ready to accept this, and we're going to do something beautiful with it.
Mm. Wow, thank you so much. And I will put a link to the Native Land website below this video for folks who want to get started right now, finding out about the land that you're living on. And then, yeah, it sounds like you've laid out a very clear process for folks to, with humility and gentleness and care, and actually like a willingness to listen.
I just thank you so much for getting the word out there, and getting the understanding out there, not just of how to respect the native people of this land, but how to start honoring our own indigeneity. No matter who we are, we all come from a place, we all come from a people, or in my case, multiple peoples. And to take the time to give yourself permission to honor that, and to dig deeper into the history and the herstory to understand what kind of beauty we really come from.
Yes, thank you for sharing so generously of your knowledge and your spirit. And before we finish up, I just want to invite you or ask you if there's anything in particular that you'd like to share with the audience about like what you're up to in the world, and how they can get to know more about you and what you're doing.
Yeah, right now I'm really focusing on my own personal healing and also my PhD. So there's not ways that people can necessarily directly plug into that just yet, but I'm working on creating that that window for involvement. But I am going to share with you a music video of me singing a song about Indigenous Europe. It's called Mamula, which means motherland in Welsh, and it was filmed in the United Kingdom, as it's now called, and in the last standing oak grove that wasn't destroyed for naval ships from the British Army. And just to kind of give people a little more insight into that, if they are interested, you can always follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/Lyla June, Instagram.com/Lyla June, Twitter, although I'm not a very good tweeter, but Lyla June 4NM. I just got done with a political race, so I have like this political Twitter handle. What else? I think I will be sharing a few articles too about Indigenous land practices and how you can be a part of those. So yeah, I think that's it. And just thank you so much for everything, and for taking the time to make space for these conversations, because they're so exciting and kind of juicy almost, where they can, like, there's just so much potential for exciting work. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you too. And I just want to also thank everyone who is watching and listening today. Thank you so much for joining us, for spending this time with us, and opening to these messages, and also for your willingness to act on them. And I just want to wish you lots of love and many, many blessings on your journey. Take care.